Okay. Can you hear me now? That's better. Okay, but that means that you got to enjoy a bit more of this piece of music, which is the first piece of music ever to be composed and written by a computer. This is the Iliac Suite, performed by a quartet of young musicians called the Frates Quartet, and it was written by this computer. Lear-Jan Hiller started programming this rather strange machine back in 1955 and spent almost 2 years programming that to compose the music that you just heard. Now, this might not look like the computers that you are used to using, and the reason for that is that this is a mechanical computer. And what he did was that he wrote something called a Monte Carlo simulation, which we today might have called AI, but back then it was just maths and stats. So welcome all to Highscores, a brief history of computer music. We will go on a journey through the ages where computers have composed and performed music, and we will go around the world on a spectacular ride. So sit back, lean back into your seats, and welcome along. And this is a journey that starts out just after World War II in Australia. During the Second World War, we figured out that computers were a clever thing to have. They helped win the war, and just about every country around the world started their initiatives to build computers. This is the CSIR, which was built in Australia, the Mark I of the CSIR. This does not look like what the computers that you are used to using either. It did not have the regular user interfaces with screens and such that we have, but one thing this computer had was that it had a small loudspeaker connected to it that would make sort of a beepy noise whenever it had finished processing, so that the engineers could look at the tape output and verify that it had done its work. Now, one of the engineers working with this computer realized that he could modulate the signal that was sent to that loudspeaker, and we got the first ever computer to play music. Yes, this is Colonel Bogey's March. It's marching band music, which was hugely popular after World War II, not only in Germany, but all around the world, here in Britain as well. And this little piece of music was the first ever thing to be played by a computer. And I'm very happy that this does not start out in America, because all of these stories tend to do. And of course, we cannot avoid going to the United States. And in particular, Bell Laboratories, which was the telephone company, there was an engineer working there called Max Matthews, and he was building a programming language that was known as music. It started out with Music 1 and then came through the iterations, and you can guess what the versions were. And he used this to create little pieces of music on an IBM 704 mainframe computer. And in 1957, he composed this, which is known as Silver Scales. It's a nice piece of music, concrete, sort of proto-techno thing going on there. And this was released on an album by Decca a few years later on this one, Music from Mathematics, played by the IBM mainframe computer. The first ever vinyl album with computer music on it. This would start a trend that we will come back to during this talk, but first we have to go to southwest London.
Putney, where Peter Zinoviev has a hobby which is strictly for boffins. He keeps it in his garden shed, and it's called Digital PDP 8/S. Yes, it's a computer, and it has a hobby too, composing music. Peter helps with the ideas, but the actual performance is all Digital's work.
So Peter Zinoviev, down in Putney, quite a bit of kit in his garden shed there, had started experimenting with creating digital compositions on the computer. And just like Max Matthews, he also created his own music programming language. It's called Musis, and this is what the code looks like. No regular music notations, but you would specify a note by number, and then you would have the pitch modulation and so forth. And what Peter Zinoviev did was that he wrote algorithms. And as all of the programmers in the room at least can tell that this is code. And this is code that generates musical soundtracks. And Peter Zinoviev took this with him to Queen Elizabeth Hall for the first ever live performance by a computer.
The next item, Partita for Unattended Computer by Peter Zinoviev, is a true live performance in the sense that no magnetic tape is being used at all. Furthermore, the computer has a choice at various stages in the procedure, and the piece therefore comes out different every time it's played. The performance you're about to hear is therefore unique and unrepeatable. First of all, checks are made to see that the composition is correctly loaded into the computer. The computer is started and will carry out the performance unattended.
Yes, slow burning techno banger, this one, and might be something that you can hear in a Berlin nightclub around 8 in the morning. But this was a incredible performance, the first ever live performance by a computer, and it was a sellout event. The queues were long, and rumors have it that it was impossible to get hold of a taxi afterwards. The reviews weren't so good, though. The Times wrote, technically it may be a triumph of skill and knowledge, but what we heard resembled the dreariest kind of neo-weapon drawn out into inordinate length. Now, for the less cultured among you, the term neo-weapon refers to the Austrian composer Anton von Webern, who was known for creating atonal music. The industry press, though, were really excited about this, and journals like The Wireless World and Computer Weekly wrote long pieces, page up and down, about this marvelous performance in Queen Elizabeth Hall. Let's go back to the United States, and again, Max Matthews here in the background, but also, very importantly, Carol Lochbaum in the front. Now, Bell Labs, being a telephone company, were working on making a computer able to talk, because having a talking computer is something that might come in handy as a telephone company. But Carol here came up with a brilliant idea to sit down and program into the computer, vowel by vowel, the lyrics to a song known as Daisy Bell. And we would get the first ever singing computer. And this is karaoke, so join in. Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer. I'm half crazy, all for the love of you. It would be a stylish marriage. I can't. You can do better than that. Let's do this once more. Everyone. Amazing, amazing. And if you thought that was familiar, it's not because you just sang it twice. It might be because of this.
It's called Daisy.
Because in the masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the supercomputer HAL dies, one of the most iconic death scenes in all of film history, the computer sings this song that was released a couple of years earlier and done by Bell Laboratories. A very, very nice nod to computer music history at the end of the 1960s, which brings us into the 1970s. And Space Invaders, which you incidentally can play upstairs, one of the first games ever to have a proper soundtrack. Now, you might not think of these 3 repeating bass notes as music, but it is. And it also uses this to intense a psychological response in the player, because as the aliens approach, the music increases in speed, raises your stress levels, and makes it difficult to concentrate, and increases the risk of you messing up and having to put in another quarter to play again. Now, this is the same effect that was used by Lalo Schifrin in the soundtrack to Jaws. Dun, 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 the very same year that this came out. Just a couple of years later, we got proper music. This is the first one to ever have something that resembles a soundtrack. This is Rally X. And this was also released on vinyl in 1984, 6 years after the game came out. And the musician here had to write all the notes down on a piece of paper, and the programmer then programmed this in assembly language into the computer, and it resulted in this, and it has that iconic ship sound that we would get to know later. But we could have music at home as well. So this is the Atari 2600 and a game called The Music Machine, which you would expect to have music in it. It's a very, very rare game. This was only sold in Christian bookstores. That's absolutely true. And that it could make music with this thing was a marvel, because this had something called 5-bit pitch. It did not, which means it could play 32 different tones. Tones, not notes. They did not correlate to the Western scale at all. And in addition, it had inference from the television screen. So that they could make something like this was absolutely amazing, but we deserve something better. I'm more alive than ever before. My friends are knocking down my door to get into my Commodore 64.
It's mind-boggling. Commodore 64 lets you play hundreds more games than any video machine, plus draw, program, even do music.
I'm more alive than ever before, and my friends are knocking down my door. 'Cause now we're into so much more. We're into our Commodore 64.
Legendary computer there, and legendary for the reason that it had this sound processor inside it. This is the MOS Technology 6581. And Robert Jans, the engineer who designed this one, said that all of the sound chips on the market, even those in Atari computers, were primitive and obviously designed by people who knew nothing about music. And Robert Jans wanted to change that. So he set out to design this thing to have 32 channels. It ended up having 3, but boy, could you make music with those 3 channels. So this is Mule, one of the very first games to be released on the Commodore 64. It has a primitive sounding soundtrack, but it's recognizable as chip music. And you can see it's the typical triangle waves, square waves, and so forth. But it didn't take long before people figured out how to actually make music on this thing. Yes, a couple of years later, Commando by Rob Hubbard. And look at everything that is going on. He's intermixing things across the channels and making that fat, big sound that has influenced music ever after. And this is just like playing a synthesizer. Anyone play the synthesizer here? You know that it's not about the white and black keys, it's about fiddling with the knobs on top. And that's what Rob Hubbard does on this one. So this looks absolutely great on screen and sounds even better. So why on earth does Mario from the same year sound like this? Because this is a bit bland. Nothing wrong with Koji Kondo's soundtrack, that's iconic, but the reason is this. Nintendo had decided what sort of sounds you could use. So you had 2 square waves, a triangle wave, and a noise wave. And that's all you had. And that's the reason why the early Nintendo games music mostly sounds the same, because you only had these instruments to play with. So let's get back to the SID. This is Electron SID Station. It's a synthesizer made by a Swedish company. And what they did was that they bought up the entire surplus stock of SID sound chips from the Commodore 64 and created this beauty here. And you've heard this one. If you heard music by Daft Punk, Swedish artist Robin, or Norwegian artists Röyksopp, the Prodigy have used this, loads of people have used it, Madonna have used it, but in particular Röyksopp did this thing. This is a song that was found on the flip side of their very first 7-inch single, and it's a song known as the 64 Position. They are showing off their roots here, and this was made as proper chip music. And they play this live once in a while, and it sounds good. It sounds like it should. They might have used something like this to create this. This is 17-year-old German Chris Hilsbeck, on the photo on the wall there, he entered into a competition ran by a German computer magazine back in 1986 to create the best soundtrack for the Commodore 64. He composed this bit, which is known as Shades, but he did not only do that, he also wrote this thing called the Sound Monitor, which was the tool he used to compose music with. Now, this is all hexadecimal numbers all over the screen because this is the first music composition tool that does things on the computer's premises, on the terms of the computer. And he started a trend of all of these great things that you could compose music with. Another 17-year-old German, this is Jochen Hippel. He was making music on the Atari ST computer, which was the one that I bought because it was known to have a Yamaha sound processor in there. And Yamaha is probably my favorite motorcycle / synthesizer producer in the entire world. And but it was just a generic thing produced and licensed. So it did not really sound very good, but Jochen Hippel was a wizard. So he managed to get that funky, fresh chip music sound squeezed out of that limited 3-channel processor that didn't reach the Commodore 64 one to the knees at all. But with the Motorola 68000 based computers, there was one that reigned supreme, and that was, of course, the Commodore Amiga. And that one had a 4-channel digital sample-based sound processor known as Paula. And people started making software known as sound trackers, very inspired by what was done in Germany a few years earlier, and they made music like this. This is Global Trash by Danish composer Jesper Kyd. One of his earliest compositions. These days, Jesper Kyd writes soundtracks for Hollywood films and loads of AA title computer games. But this is where it all started. But we have to have one more from the Commodore Amiga, one of the most classic games ever released, Turrican 2, because this soundtrack is a collaboration between the two Germans, Chris Hilsbeck and Jochen Hippel. Chris Hilsbeck composing the music, Jochen Hippel coming up with the ingenious technology to actually make this sound as fat as it does. Because remember, the Amiga had 4 channels, this soundtrack has 7. So Chris Hilsbeck used the techniques that Jochen Hippel had invented for the Atari ST to squeeze even more sound out of the Commodore Amiga. These are a few 12 inches from my own record collection, and they're all by a Norwegian house music producer known as Erot. I will let someone else tell this story.
You would be correct to call those records seminal that he made because listen to them.
People should be aware of the equipment he used to make those records. People would laugh now. Your phone is more powerful.
The stuff he did freed a lot of producers from what they believed was right and wrong. Producers like him is really necessary for music to grow.
Yes, Battlestar XB12 or 7 by Erot, made in his bedroom on a very primitive PC using this kind of software, and he was one of the people who changed the entire house music scene and the birth of Scandi Disco way back then. But this happened in the UK as well. This is Calvin Harris from his debut album, song called Acceptable in the 80s. The entire album was created on a Commodore Amiga 1200 computer, because back then he was not a big name producer, but he did something that would have been acceptable in the 80s, composing music on a Commodore Amiga. Let's move on.
A scientist creates the ultimate machine. A machine that will give him the power to journey into the mega world with thousands of colors, 16-bit graphic technology, and 10-channel mega stereo sound. The most advanced video game system in the universe.
Yes!
Mega Drive from Sega.
Mega Drive from Sega, and I had this thing in it. Again, back to Yamaha. This one you heard before. This is the Yamaha DX7 sound processor. And this is the sound processor that was used on Aha's breakthrough hit Take On Me. This one. So suddenly, musicians making game music had the same hardware as Aha had their worldwide hit with to create music. And this is music from the game Street Fighter. And here they use the soundtrack to tell a background story to the characters, which is a really difficult thing to do for a fighting game like this one, which is interesting, but it also birthed an entire subgenre of hip-hop.
It's
D-double. Old time swerve on production. It's street fighting time.
If it's me or my dad, you get a scar on your chest like that. She fighting, that's what I'm bad at. My thing working
Perfect.
I come through in the beat up under. Give man a under slaps like the under. Give it the mic and let me ride it for them, cause I spit the fire just like
Sim. Just like Sim. Something known as Street Fighter hip hop. And there are loads of artists doing this. This is the jazz musician Kamasi Washington Jr., who was a big fan of Street Fighter when he was a kid, so much that he recorded his own Street Fighter theme song for himself called Street Fighter Mark, which is this. Loads of artists have used elements of Street Fighter in their music. These are just a few of them, and there are quite a lot. But Street Fighter hip hop is big with Lupe Fiasco. Lupe Fiasco entered into a Street Fighter tournament, went up as against the reigning Street Fighter world champion, Diego Umera, and he ended up winning this, becoming the world master Street Fighter. That's pretty impressive. So when you have an intro like that to a game, you are sort of setting the bar high. And this is the game Wing Commander. And the developers of this game set out to create a space opera akin to Star Wars. And this was the first game to have an adaptive soundtrack. So when you engage into battle, as will happen quite soon, we will hear the soundtrack changing and getting more sort of beatsy drums coming in there and getting more and more intense. First game ever to do this, it was a big one, but the one to do this properly was this one. This is Monkey Island 2, an absolute classic with a great Caribbean soundtrack to it. And as Guybrush Threepwood walks around, I think it's Melee Island here, the soundtrack changes as he moves along. And for this one, Michael Land, who wrote the soundtrack, wanted to use the computer as sort of a pit orchestra to have something that complements the action on screen. And he did this very, very nicely.
Let me tell you what bugs me about human endeavour. I've never been the human in question. Have you? Mankind went to the moon. I don't even know where Grimsby is. Forget progress by proxy. Land on your own moon. It's no longer about what they can achieve out there in your behalf, but what we can experience up here in our own time. It's called mental wealth.
Mental wealth. So this is a unreleased advert for the Sony PlayStation. And the Sony PlayStation was marketed a bit differently than what video games usually were. This was mainly marketed in nightclubs. And you would have soundtracks like this by The Prodigy. The reason for that is that it had a CD player in it, so they could play music straight off the CD. And you got some good songs, but bad video game soundtracks, because this was just like popping a CD in your car. We have to have more limited technology to get good computer game music at that time, and this is the game GoldenEye 64 on the Nintendo 64, which didn't even have a sound processor, so everything had to be done by the main chip. It did not have a lot of memory, but still they managed to squeeze this together with this John Barry soundtrack, those banging drums that sounds like Faith No More's We Care a Lot, and it's absolutely brilliant. Other brilliant soundtracks on this one is the Endless Staircase in Mario 64. This was created using an algorithm in-game, because when Mario runs up these stairs, it goes on forever and ever, and it has a soundtrack that seems to be rising and rising and rising in pitch. They are using a illusion here, something known as the Shepherd scale, with two scales moving in parallel, and it was all done programmatically within the game. If you like this, you'll find videos on YouTube with 24 hours of this going on. We do not have time for that. When Apple opened up the App Store for the iPhone, one of the first apps to be released was Brian Eno's Bloom, which uses some of the same techniques as he used on his breakaway success album Music for Airports, Ambient 1, which was where ambient music was born. And you can just touch the screen to create soundtracks. It's absolutely mesmerizing. And Brian Eno used the same techniques when he composed the soundtrack for Spore. It was programmed in a visual programming language known as Pure Data. It looks like this. And this gives the game engine loads of variables it could change to make adaptive music. So this is properly programmed music. But when they set out to create No Man's Sky, an open universe with 18 quintillion planets, they had to have an endless soundtrack that fit with that. And the math rock band 16 Seconds of Static were hired to do that. And on commission, they created a soundtrack that could be recomposed by the game engine in endless varieties to have a soundtrack that fits to this. And compared to what Brian Eno did, which was ambient, sort of boring spa music, this was a proper rock soundtrack with some jazz elements in there and so forth. Those were the only proper artists to do video game music. This is the game Quake with an industrial rock soundtrack by the Nine Inch Nails. This is the game Omnicron. This is the game Moonwalker, which features Michael Jackson and the Michael Jackson soundtrack. And there has long been a rumor that Michael Jackson composed music for Sega games, and in particular the Sonic the Hedgehog games. So this is obviously Smooth Criminal. Let's do something more interesting. So this is the song Stranger in Moscow by Michael Jackson. But it's also a song from Sonic 3, Sonic and Knuckles, layered on top. And they fit like hand in glove. So the rumors about Michael Jackson composing music for Sonic the Hedgehog are absolutely true. So the reason he wouldn't let them put his name on it was that he didn't like what it sounded like, even if it was in 10-channel mega stereo sound. This one says 1 minute left. I think I have 10, I hope. Do I? Yeah, I do. Okay. The Eurovision Song Contest is on this week. And this is a project by a French company called Flow Machines and a music project known as Shigge. It's one of the first musical compositions to be done mostly by an AI. This AI was trained on French pop songs from the 1980s. So it's fairly cheesy. This was released back in 2018. And large language models weren't quite what they are today. Back then, the lyrics were written by the computer as well. It's absolute gibberish. But it sounds quite good. The music here is mostly performed by humans. Some of the strings are played by the computer. The interesting thing about Flow Machines is that they also trained a model on the Eurovision Song Contest entries. And they tried to enter into the competition, but they weren't allowed because it was only for humans, which is a bit strange when you see some of the acts that are on there. Something more. So this is folk music. And it's a project by Odin Bentall, a recurrent neural network trained on 25,000 Irish folk songs. And it sounds pretty proper. It's obviously played by humans though. But the thing is that this is the way that, that folk music has developed through and evolved through times. Is you had one player playing something and another player heard it, picked it up, played his own version of it, and someone else heard that again, played their own version of it, which is exactly how an AI learns. It learns by listening to other things and then imitates. So folk music is probably the best use case for composing music using AIs, and this sounds fairly good. So this talk is an ever-evolving one. When I started doing the new 2024 remix, the best sort of AI sound generation thing that was out there was something called Refusion. And you're listening to something I created with that. This is Refusion doing Detroit hip-hop. And it does not sound like Detroit hip-hop. And I have to say, Detroit gave us some of the best golden era hip-hop there was. You have things like The Far Side, Eminem is from Detroit. This is The Far Side Running, composed by the late great Jay Dilla, one of the most influential producers in all of hip-hop history. In fact, Jay Dilla is known for inventing an entirely new time signature. We were used to having straight time and swing time, but the way that Jay Dilla programmed his music is now known as Dilla time, and there are actually musicologists studying this. There is a book known as by the name of Dilla time that is written by a professor on a music university in the United States who has done his doctorate on Jay Dilla. So I think producing something like the thing we just heard is not really fair to the legacy of Detroit hip-hop. But there was something interesting happening just after I started working on this, and it had something to do with Nick Cave. Nick Cave runs a blog known as the Red Hand Files, and you always get MP sent in by fans with lyrics written in the style of Nick Cave. And he wrote a really, really great takedown, a real good scolding of the lyrics that he has on his blog. And then something interesting happened. This is Drake and The Weeknd. All of a sudden, there was a song that popped up on Spotify that charted millions of plays, known as Heart on My Sleeve, a duet between these two. The thing was that this was not a song released by any of these people. It was a song created by a voice AI trained to imitate the voices of these two artists. And it was taken down after a week or so from Spotify and all the other streaming services. Incidentally, not because they were imitating some proper artist, but because of an uncleared sample in the beat. True story. So, but this inspired me a bit to see what could I do. So last summer, I looked at what are the best services out there. So I went out and did this thing. Sorry, we have to do this one. This is the Heart on My Sleeve song. I have to play it for you as well. One that charted on Spotify, but what I did was I composed this thing.
In the depths of the night, I hear a call, a voice that echoes through the hall. It's a siren, a song that pulls me and takes me to a place where I can begin. I am the sinner, I am the saint, I am the darkness, I am the light, I am the hunter, I am the prey, I am the devil, I am the savior. I walk the streets with my head held high. I've got my demons, but I'll make them fly. I'll dance with the devil and I'll play his game. I'll be the one to call his name.
And if Nick Cave saw this, he would absolutely kill me. These are the lyrics that Mike from Christchurch had sent to him that... let's wait a bit with this one. That Mike from Christchurch sent, and that was published on his blog, that I took and put into a voice model that I trained on an a cappella with Drake's voice, and then made it sort of sing the vocals for me. Then I went to another service that makes beats, asked it to do a trap beat for me, and then I just pieced them together. It took me maybe 15 minutes to do, and that was sort of where AI-generated music was at back then. But yesterday morning, I was in my hotel room, and I figured it's been a few months since last time I did an experiment like that, so I composed this thing.
In pixels and codes, music shiny on flaws. A speech in life for the digital world. It is outside code, music shiny on flaws. A speech in life for the digital world. Activities where innovation goes. In music halls, where music rocks. And beats in the harmonious remnant, a symphony of tech that knows no end.
Proper banger. So this lyrics written by ChatGPT, I asked it to write me some bars about me giving a speech in Islington at a conference called DevOps. The speech was about computer music. Then I just took the lyrics, pasted them into a AI that's known as Studio, and asked it to do urban pop music with a bit upbeat tempo. And this is the result. It took me 2 minutes to do that. Then I spent like another half an hour to piece together this music video from stock footage and having to write in the subtitles myself because the AI wasn't smart enough to read them out of the lyrics themselves. So this is where it's at today, and it's a bit scary, isn't it, for those of us who love music. I could create this banger in 2 minutes. This sort of gets me to think a bit, because I absolutely love music, and I always have. I've played instruments for quite some time. I can't sing for shit, so I don't do that. But when things sound as good as they do with this, it's hard to distinguish. The first example we heard with the Detroit hip-hop by Refusion was obviously garbage. This was also garbage, but not as smelly, and it sort of sounds convincing. And I think there are quite a few radio stations that could play this. And it changes things. The Drake and Travis Scott hit Sicko Mode from a few years back had 20 people or 30 people on the writing credits for that. Because writing credits is where the money is at in the music industry these days. So when you get computers writing and producing all the music, who earns the money? That's a big question. The other thing is that what makes music so great is that when people put their heart and soul into it, it's about the emotional connections. And it might not be that easy to get that connection with a computer. But all in all, these are probably just tools that we can use. And once upon a time, the piano was also looked upon as something very dangerous towards music. That would be the end of it all. That didn't really happen. And I think I will leave you with this.
Machines are making most of the music now. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed that all the songs sound the same? I mean, I don't know if you've noticed that. I mean, that I mean, you could be hearing one song. I mean, you could take the lyrics from another song and put it right onto, because the rhythms are the same. You know, the drum and the drones are the same, and the machines can only do so much. You know, they can only make it sound different so many different kinds of ways. So it doesn't sound different. It sounds all the same. And that's good for the industry because a lot of people invent these machines and need, and sell these machines. Plus, it's also very good is you could have your own little band, like a one-man band with these machines. You know what I mean?
You could have your own little band with these machines. So this is Bob Dylan from an interview in 1987 where he talks about machines are making all the music these days. There has been quite a lot of great music produced and released from 1987 and up until today. And I think even if we have these new tools, they are just tools for creativity, and it democratizes music. So all of you can go out and create your own music, but promise me one thing: put your heart and soul into it, and I don't care whether it's something that sounds as awful as the thing that I just made, or if it's something really proper. Thank you all for coming. I'm Anders NORÅS. This has been Highscores, brief history of computer music.